The second chair had been sitting on Nelson Whitaker's porch for 3 years before anyone ever sat in it, and every man who passed through the high country of Colorado knew better than to ask him why he had built it. Nelson was not the kind of man who invited questions. He was not the kind of man who invited company either, which was precisely why he had built his cabin 17 miles north of Creede, Colorado, in the autumn of 1882, on a ledge of rock and pine that looked out over a valley so wide and so quiet that on certain mornings the silence itself felt like something holy. He had come up from Texas with nothing but a mule, a Winchester rifle, a hand saw, and a box of chisels, and in the space of one brutal winter, he had raised 4 walls and a roof sturdy enough to hold 2 feet of Sierra Madre snowfall without so much as a groan from the ridgepole. He was 31 years old and built like the mountains he lived in, broad through the shoulders and long in the leg, with hands that were scarred from the work he loved and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 weeks at the time he carved that second chair. His hair was the color of dark walnut wood, and his eyes were a gray so pale they almost looked like creek water when the light was on them just right. He was not an ugly man by any measure, but he wore his solitude like a second skin, and most folks in Creede simply accepted that Nelson Whitaker was a fixture of the high country the same way the elk were present, formidable, and entirely uninterested in civilization. He had built the first chair in the November of 1882, carving it from a length of ponderosa pine he had felled himself, fitting the joints together with a patience that most men could not have summoned for anything short of prayer. It was a good chair, balanced and solid, with a high back that supported the spine just right when a man wanted to sit and watch the sun go down over the valley. He set it on the porch and he sat in it every evening that first winter, alone with a cup of coffee and his thoughts, and he told himself that was enough. He built the second chair in the spring of 1883, on a morning in April when the snow was still heavy in the high passes, but the south-facing slope below his cabin had begun to show patches of bare earth and the first pale green of new grass. He did not plan it. He woke up that morning with the image already fully formed in his mind, the way a dream sometimes refuses to dissolve when you open your eyes, and before breakfast was done, he had gone out to the woodpile and selected a length of pine that had been curring all winter. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, shaping and smoothing, fitting the back rails with the same careful tenoning he had used on the first chair, and when he was done, the 2 chairs sat side by side on the porch like a pair of old friends. He never explained it to anyone. Old Pete Garland, who ran the supply store in Creede and made the monthly run up the mountain trail with provisions, noticed the second chair on his June delivery and squinted at it for a long moment before deciding that some questions were better left unasked. He set the flour and salt and coffee on the porch steps and accepted the coins Nelson pressed into his palm, and that was the end of it. It was not as though Nelson was waiting. He would not have used that word himself. He simply sat in his chair every evening and let the other chair sit empty beside him, and if there was something in his chest that occasionally pulled toward that emptiness like a compass needle finding north, he did not name it. He had known loneliness before, and he had known its cousin, grief, and he had decided some years past that the cure for both was work and open sky, not the complicated business of people. He trapped fur through the winters, taking beaver and marten and the occasional fox from the streams that ran through his valley, curring the pelts in the cold, dry air of the cabin, and selling them in Creede when the thaws came. In the summers, he hired himself out to the silver mining operations that were beginning to press into the mountains around Creede, not as a miner but as a guide and a packer, a man who knew which passes were safe, and which ones would open a man's skull against a limestone wall if he did not know what he was doing. He was good at it, and he was fair, and he did not cheat anyone, and the miners and the Asiers and the camp bosses respected him for all of that, even if they did not entirely understand him. The summer of 1884 moved through the mountains the way all Colorado summers did, brilliant and brief and slightly too warm at midday, and cold again by the time the stars came out. Nelson guided 3 separate pack trains through the high passes between July and August, collected his wages, bought his winter supplies, and returned to his cabin on the ledge with the feeling he always had when he came home, that of a man stepping out of a current that had been pulling at him and finding solid ground underfoot again. It was on a Tuesday evening in the first week of September, 1884, that Nelson Whitaker's life changed in a manner he could not have predicted if he had spent all 3 years of that empty second chair's existence trying. He heard the horse before he saw it. He was on the porch with his coffee, watching the last of the evening light turn the western clouds a color somewhere between copper and rose, when the sound of hooves on the rocky trail below the cabin reached him. It was not a sound he expected, because the trail to his cabin was not a road and was not marked, and the only people who came up it were Pete Garland on his mule and the occasional trapper looking for directions. But this was a single horse moving at a walk, and the rhythm of it was wrong, uneven in a way that told him the animal was tired. He set his coffee down and stood up and rested his hand on the porch rail and waited. The horse that came around the bend in the trail was a dark bay mare, a good horse with clean legs but clearly exhausted, her sides damp with old sweat, her head low. On her back sat a woman. Nelson had not been expecting a woman. He was not entirely certain what he had been expecting, but it was not this. She was sitting straight in the saddle in the deliberate way that people sit straight when they are operating on the last of their energy, and they know it. And she was wearing a dress the color of dark blue cloth that had seen better days, with a wool coat over it that was too light for the mountain evenings, and a hat that had started out respectable, and had since lost an argument with weather. There was a carpetbag tied behind her saddle and a smaller satchel over her shoulder, and that appeared to be the whole of her worldly goods. She saw him on the porch, and she pulled the mare to a stop at the foot of the path that led up to the cabin, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice carried up to him clearly in the mountain quiet. "I am looking for the town of Creede. I was told it was southeast of this position, but I have been riding southeast for what seems like longer than that." "You overshot it," Nelson said. "You went past the fork about 4 miles back. Creede is 7 miles south from that fork." She closed her eyes very briefly, and even from the porch he could see the particular quality of that expression, the kind of stillness a person holds when they are absorbing information that is both entirely unsurprising and utterly disheartening. "Of course I did," she said quietly. She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. "Is there anywhere nearby where my horse can rest? She has had a long day, a longer day than I planned for." Nelson looked at the mare and saw the truth of what the woman was saying in the animal's posture. "I have a corral and a lean-to," he said. "Bring her up." The woman dismounted at the bottom of the path, and Nelson noted that she did so with the practiced ease of someone who had ridden a great deal, not a novice, though she winced slightly when she hit the ground, and he thought that she too had had a longer day than she had planned for. She led the mare up the path, and Nelson came down from the porch to meet her at the corral gate. Up close she was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark brown hair that had partially escaped whatever arrangement it had started the day in, and eyes that were a warm, clear brown, direct in the way that people's eyes are direct when they have decided long ago that directness is the only practical approach to the world. There was a quality to her face that was not quite beauty in the way that word was thrown around, but something better, a kind of settled intelligence that made you want to look at her and keep looking, the way you looked at a well-made thing and kept finding new details to appreciate. "Thank you," she said, handing him the mare's reins with a gravity that told him she did not thank people lightly. "She needs water first," he said, "then grain, then rest." "I know," she said, and there was no defensiveness in it, just acknowledgement, and Nelson found that he had slightly revised his first estimation of her upward. He watered and grained the mare and settled her in the linta with fresh straw while the woman stood at the corral fence and watched him work. She did not offer hollow conversation or unnecessary commentary, and he found he appreciated that too. When the horse was seen to, he looked at the woman and the woman looked at him, and there was a moment of that particular mountain silence that he had spent 3 years cultivating. "I am Letitia Hawthorne," she said. "I was a schoolteacher in St. Louis. I meant to be the new schoolteacher in Creede. I have a contract beginning on the 15th of this month." "Nelson Whitaker," he said. "Today is the 8th. "I am aware," she said. "I left myself what I thought was adequate time. I did not account for the stage line in Pueblo being 2 days behind schedule, or for losing my way in these mountains, or for—" She stopped and pressed her lips together. "I find myself at a deficit of time and a surplus of complications." "The stage doesn't run up this far," he said. "Where did you hire the horse?" "From a livery in a town called South Fork. The man there told me the trail to Creede was straightforward." "He was not wrong," Nelson said. "In good weather with the right fork it is. Did he draw you a map?" "He drew me something he called a map," she said, with a precision that told him the something in question had not been particularly map-like. Nelson was quiet for a moment. The evening air around them had that particular late September chill that came down off the high peaks just after sunset, and he could see that the woman's wool coat was not doing the work that it needed to do. She was not shivering yet, but she was holding herself in a careful way. "You will want to stay the night," he said. "The trail back to Creede in the dark is not safe, not for a horse that is as tired as this one." He watched her absorb that and saw the calculation happen behind her eyes, the same calculation any sensible woman alone in the mountains would be making, the weighing of known risk against unknown. "Is there a neighbor?" she asked. "Or any other homestead nearby?" "Nearest homestead is 8 miles east," he said. "The Delaney family, good people, but you would be riding in the dark to get there, same problem." She looked at the cabin, she looked at him, she was taking his measure the same way he had taken hers, and he had the sense that she was good at it. "Do you have a wife?" she asked. "No," he said. "Sisters, daughters, any female kin on the premises?" "No," he said. "I see." She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "I appreciate your directness. I will impose on your hospitality for the evening if the offer is genuine. I am a practical woman, Mr. Whitaker, and I have been practical my whole life, but I have never been impractical enough to ride mountain trails in the dark when a reasonable alternative presents itself." "The offer is genuine," he said. "Then I accept it," she said. "Thank you." He fed her. It was a simple meal, beans and salt pork and cornbread, nothing that required ceremony, and she ate it with a straightforward appreciation that he found comfortable, not effusive, not performative, just genuine. She ate everything on her plate and then sat back and wrapped her hands around the tin cup of coffee he gave her and looked around the interior of his cabin with the attentive curiosity of a person who is reading a room the way other people read books. The cabin was not cluttered, but it was full. There were his tools along one wall, organized with a carpenter's obsessive precision. There were shelves of supplies and a row of books, more books than most mountain men kept, because Nelson had always been a reader and had never seen the point in giving it up simply because he lived alone. There were the pelts from last winter's trapping, a few still waiting to be taken to Creede. There were 2 carved wooden figures on the mantelpiece, small things, an elk and a horse that he had made on winter evenings when the darkness outside was absolute and his hands needed to be occupied. "You made those," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "And the chairs on the porch," she said. "Yes," he said. "They are very good," she said. "The proportions are exactly right. Most handmade chairs are either too narrow in the seat or too low in the back. Yours are neither." He looked at her. "You know chairs. My father was a furniture maker in Baltimore," she said. "Before we moved west, I spent my childhood handing him chisels and holding things steady while the glue dried. I know chairs." There was something that moved through his chest at that, something small but distinct, like the first shift of ice in a river at the end of winter. He said nothing, but he was aware of it. She slept on his rope bed, which he gave her without discussion, and he rolled his blanket on the floor beside the stove, which was where he would have told anyone to sleep and thought nothing of it. In the morning he woke before she did and built the fire up and made coffee, and when she came out of sleep she did it with the directness she seemed to bring to everything, no pretense of lingering, just a steady opening of her eyes and a sitting up and a looking around to establish where she was and what the situation required. "Good morning," she said. "Coffee is ready," he said. She sat at the table and drank her coffee, and he stood by the stove and drank his, and the morning came in through the window in long golden bars, and the valley below the cabin was filled with pale mist that the sun was slowly burning off. "I should leave within the hour," she said. "If I want to reach Creede by midday and give myself time to find my accommodation and see to the schoolhouse before, I will ride with you," he said. She looked at him. "The fork where you need to turn is easy to miss if you don't know it," he said. "It is easy to miss even if you do know it. The trail is also steep in places. Your horse will be rested, but she should have a steady pace set for her." All of that was true. Every word of it was true. He was also aware that it was not the complete explanation for why he had said it, but he did not examine that too closely. "I do not want to take you away from your work," she said. "I have no pressing work this morning," he said. That was also true. She considered him for another moment. "All right," she said. "I accept. Again." They rode down the mountain together in the early morning, her bay mare picking her way carefully down the rocky stretches, his big gray gelding Amos stepping along with the bored competence of a horse that had done this particular trail many hundreds of times. The aspens had begun to turn, and the trail wound through stands of gold and copper that flickered in the morning breeze like something lit from within. Letitia rode just slightly ahead on the narrower stretches and alongside him on the wider ones, and she looked at the mountains with the same direct attention she brought to everything else, taking them in with her eyes fully open, not performing wonder but genuinely experiencing it. "I have never been this far west," she said, somewhere on the middle section of the trail. "I grew up in Baltimore and then St. Louis." I had read about the mountains, but reading about something and being inside it are very different propositions. "They are," he agreed. "Do you ever stop being struck by it?" she asked. After years of seeing it, he thought about that honestly because she had asked honestly. "No," he said. "Different things strike me at different times. In January it is the silence after a heavy snowfall. In July it is the wildflowers in the high meadows. Right now it is the aspens." She turned to look at him then, a full look, not a glance, and he felt the weight of her attention the way you felt a hand laid on your shoulder. "That is a good answer," she said. They reached the fork and he pointed it out and showed her where it was easy to miss. A narrower track angling south between two boulders that looked from the trail above like a dead end, but opened up after 20 feet into a clear path. She studied it and nodded. "I see it now," she said. "You will see it coming and going after this," he said. They rode on into Creede together, and he saw her to the office of one Randolph Gentry, the town's school board chairman, a florid, enthusiastic man of about 50 who pumped Letitia's hand and told her 3 times in the space of 2 minutes that the children of Creede were very fortunate indeed. He spared a nod for Nelson and seemed somewhat puzzled by his presence, but Nelson offered no explanation, and Letitia simply said that Mr. Whitaker had been kind enough to guide her down from the mountain, which was both accurate and sufficient. Nelson watched her walk into Gentry's office, and he stood with Amos's reins in his hand in the main street of Creede for a moment, in the noise and the smell of a working silver town, and he was aware of a very specific sensation in his chest that he identified, with some reluctance, as the sensation of not wanting to leave. He left anyway. He had provisions to buy and a trail home to ride and work waiting for him, and he was not a man who lingered over feelings any more than he lingered over anything else. But on the ride home, alone on the mountain trail with the aspens turning gold around him, and Amos moving steadily beneath him. He found himself thinking about the way she had said, "That is a good answer," with the full weight of her attention behind it, and the quiet, companionable way she had ridden beside him through the morning mist, and the way she had looked at the carved elk and horse on his mantelpiece with the practiced eye of a woman who had grown up handing chisels to her father. When he got back to the cabin, he sat in his chair on the porch for a long time, and he looked at the empty chair beside him, and he did not say anything about it even to himself. He went into Creede 2 weeks later, earlier than he had planned, on the pretense that he needed to check on the prices being offered for November trapping supplies. That was true as far as it went. He also, while he was in town, walked past the schoolhouse on what he told himself was the most direct route between the general store and the assier's office, which it was not. Through the schoolhouse window, he could hear the sound of children reciting multiplication tables in the particular sing-song rhythm that children use, and he slowed his steps and listened for a moment, and then he felt foolish and walked on. He was buying a new hatchet handle in the hardware store when she came in. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a dark green one that suited the particular quality of her coloring, and she had her hair pinned up in a way that was practical and neat, and she was carrying a list in her hand and consulting it with her brow furrowed in the way of a person working through a problem. She saw him and her face opened into a genuine smile, not the polite kind, the kind that started in the eyes. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I thought I might not see you until spring." "I had supplies to order," he said. "I am glad you came in," she said. "I wanted to thank you properly for the other week. I was tired and rather distracted that evening, and I am not certain I expressed adequate gratitude." "You expressed plenty," he said. "I don't think I did," she said. "You fed me and gave me your bed and rode me safely down a mountain. That is a considerable debt." "It is not a debt," he said. "It was a reasonable thing to do." "All the same," she said, "I would like to repay it in whatever way is appropriate. Is there a good time to come for supper?" "I cook reasonably well, which I understand is a genuine commodity in a mountain cabin." He looked at her for a moment, at the directness in her brown eyes and the composure with which she offered what she was offering, which was simple and practical and meant exactly what it said and nothing more and nothing less. He said, "Sunday would be good." She came on Sunday. She arrived at midday with a basket over one arm that contained, as it turned out, a jar of preserved peaches she had brought from St. Louis, a length of smoked sausage she had traded for at the general store, and the ingredients for a corn pudding she made in his cast iron pot over the stove with the efficiency of a woman who was accustomed to working in whatever kitchen was available. He sat at the table and watched her work, and they talked. He was not typically a man who found talking easy, but she made it easy by asking real questions and giving real answers, and by not filling silences the way some people did, anxiously, as though quiet were a thing that needed to be managed. She had come to Creede because the pay was better than St. Louis, she told him, but also because she had needed a change that was significant enough to constitute a genuine change. Her mother had died in the winter of 1883, and after 2 years of caring for her through a long illness, Letitia had emerged on the other side of the grief with the sense that her life needed to mean something more and different than it had meant before. She had applied for the teaching post because Creede was new enough to have genuine need and far enough from everything familiar to constitute a real departure. "Were you frightened?" he asked her. "Constantly," she said, without any drama attached to it. "I am frightened most of the time, if I am honest. I have simply decided that the cost of staying safe is higher than the cost of being frightened." He thought about that for the rest of the day, and then for several days after she had ridden back down the mountain on her rested bay mare, and he kept turning it over the way you turn a smooth stone in your hand, feeling the weight and the shape of it. She came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. It became a thing, over the course of October, that she rode up on Sundays when the weather permitted and they cooked together, or she cooked while he worked on the porch, and they talked through the afternoon, and she rode back to Creede before dark. It was an arrangement that made sense in every practical way, and Nelson was honest enough with himself to know that it also made sense in ways that were not entirely practical. He found himself doing things during the week that he had not done before. He repaired a loose shutter on the cabin that had been banging in the wind for 2 years without much bothering him. He laid in a better supply of coffee because she preferred it strong, and he had been buying a lesser quality. He shot a deer in the second week of October and smoked some of the meat in the way that kept it tender, not because he needed the variety, but because he thought she would like it. On the third Sunday in October she arrived in the rain, which was unusual for her because she was sensible about weather, and when she came up the path to the porch her coat was soaked through and her hat was doing nothing useful, and she was cheerful in spite of all of it, which struck him as a remarkable thing. "The trail was muddier than I expected," she said, from under the dripping hat brim. "Come in," he said. "Get out of that coat." She came in and he took her coat and hung it near the stove to dry, and she stood near the fire and shook some of the water off her hat and looked around his cabin with the comfortable familiarity she had developed over the past several weeks, and something about the naturalness of it, the way she moved through his space as though she knew where everything was, struck him somewhere deep in the chest. He made tea, because coffee seemed wrong for a cold, wet afternoon, and they sat at the table and she told him about the week she had had. 2 of her older students had gotten into a fight, the kind of fight that started over some perceived slight and escalated in the way of young men with too much energy, and not enough of it directed anywhere useful. She had separated them and made them both sit inside during recess for a week, and one of the fathers had come to express his displeasure at his son being disciplined by a woman, and she had heard him out and then explained, with a clarity and a lack of heat that she seemed to be able to summon whenever it was needed, that his son's behavior was his son's responsibility and the discipline was the school board's prerogative, and if he disagreed with either of those things he was welcome to take it up with Mr. Gentry. "And did he?" Nelson asked. "He did," she said. "Mr. Gentry told him that Miss Hawthorne's authority in the schoolroom was absolute and suggested he direct his energies toward teaching his son better manners." She paused. "I thought more highly of Mr. Gentry after that." "Gentry is not a bad man," Nelson said. "He is mostly talk, but the talk is usually in the right direction." She looked at him over her tea. "Have you lived here long enough to know everyone in Creede?" "Long enough," he said. "I have been in this valley since '82. What brought you here?" She asked. "You were in Texas before, you mentioned." He was quiet for a moment, and she waited in the way she waited, without filling the space or seeming impatient with it. "I had a ranch in Texas," he said, "outside of Amarillo. It was my father's ranch and then it was mine. I worked it for 4 years after my father died. Then a drought came that was bad enough to end it, and I sold the land for what I could get and I came north." "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it in the specific way, not the general social way. "It was the right end to that chapter," he said. "The ranch was my father's dream more than mine. I was good at running it, but I was not happy in the way a man should be happy in his own life. When I came up into these mountains, I understood for the first time what it felt like to be exactly where you were supposed to be." She was looking at him with an attention that was different from her usual attention, deeper and more particular, and he was aware that he had said more just now than he typically said to anyone about anything, and that it had not felt like too much. "I think I understand that feeling," she said quietly. "I had it for the first time when I came over the pass into this valley. There was a moment when I could see the whole length of it spread below me, and I thought, oh, this is what I was traveling toward." Yes. The fire in the stove crackled, and the rain came down steady on the cabin roof, and Nelson looked at Letitia Hawthorne sitting across his table in the warm amber light of the afternoon, and he felt something very clear and very certain settle into him, the way a tent peg settles when it finally finds solid ground after 3 attempts at soft earth. He did not say anything about it that day. He was not a man who moved fast on important things. But November came, and with it the first real snowfall of the season, and the Sunday visits had to be suspended because the trail between the cabin and Creede became genuinely hazardous for a woman riding alone, and Nelson found that the suspension of the Sunday visits was substantially more disruptive to his inner weather than he had expected. He went into Creede on a Wednesday in the second week of November, packing down 2 winters' worth of beaver pelts to sell to the fur buyer who came through town before the passes closed. He sold the pelts at a fair price, and then went to the general store for his winter provisions, and on his way back through town, he stopped at the schoolhouse door. It was the end of the school day, and he could hear the sound of children leaving, the particular joyful chaos of young people released from obligation, and after a few minutes of it the door opened and Letitia came out and found him standing on the step. She looked at him for a moment and then she smiled, and he noticed that the smile came faster now, before she had time to put the composure in front of it. "You came into town," she said. "Pelts to sell," he said. "I thought I would stop." "I am glad you did," she said. She looked at the gray sky above the main street of Creede. "It will snow again tonight. Are you riding back this afternoon?" "I plan to," he said. "Have supper with me first," she said. "I have a room at the Calloway boarding house. Mrs. Calloway is a tolerant woman, and I believe she would set an extra plate if I asked." He had supper with her at the Calloway boarding house, at a long table with 4 other boarders, including a young Assyr from back east and an older widow woman named Mrs. Pratt who managed the millinery shop on the main street. Mrs. Calloway put a plate in front of him and talked at him with the amiable persistence of a woman who gathered all available information about all available people. And Letitia sat across the table from him and ate her supper, and watched him navigate the conversation with the various people at the table. And once, when the young Assyr said something particularly obtuse about the intelligence of minors versus the intelligence of college-educated men, Nelson replied in a way that was quiet and precise, and shut the conversation down without any hostility, and he saw in Letitia's eyes a flicker of something that looked like admiration, though she did not say anything about it. After supper they stood on the porch of the boarding house in the cold evening air, and he pulled his coat collar up and she folded her arms against the chill, and they looked up the main street of Creede at the lights in the windows, and the movement of people finishing their evening business. "The trail is going to close for real in another week or 2, he said. "I know," she said. "I will be up there through most of the winter," he said. "That is how it usually goes." "I know that too," she said, and then there was a pause and she said, "I will miss the Sundays." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead down the street, not at him, and the lamplight from the nearest window caught the line of her jaw and the slight set of her shoulders that told him she had committed to saying what she had said and was not going to walk it back. "So will I," he said. She looked at him then, and it was a different kind of look than any she had given him before, private and careful and warm, and he felt it in the center of his chest like a coal newly caught. "Nelson," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and he felt that too. "Letitia," he said. She laughed then, a small surprised laugh, and the laughter transformed her face in a way that made him catch his breath. "We are being very careful with each other," she said. "I am not a man who is careless with things that matter," he said. She was quiet, and then she said very softly, "Neither am I." He rode home in the first snowfall of the season, alone on the dark mountain trail, and the snow came down in fat, slow flakes around him, and Amos moved through it with the unconcerned steadiness of long habit, and Nelson rode the whole way home with a warmth in him that the cold could not touch. He wrote her a letter. He was not a man who wrote letters easily, but he understood the necessity of it when the trails were closed, and he was better on paper than he expected to be, perhaps because the patience required for writing was not unlike the patience required for woodworking, one word at a time, each one fitting the next. He wrote her about the first week of the true winter, about a bull elk he had seen on the ridge above the cabin at dawn, standing in the new snow with his breath making clouds in the cold air, magnificent and entirely unconcerned with Nelson's observation of him. He wrote about the stars on clear nights, which were different in winter than in other seasons, sharper and more numerous, as though the cold cleaned the sky of anything that might obscure them. He wrote about the book he was reading, a collection of essays by a naturalist who had traveled the West some years before, and about the ways in which the man's observations were accurate, and the ways in which they were clearly those of someone who had looked at the West from outside rather than inside. He sent the letter with Pete Garland on the old man's last run before the pass closed. She wrote back. The letter found him 3 weeks later on one of Pete Garland's nephew's rare midwinter supply runs, and he read it at the table with his coffee, and then read it again, and then set it down and looked at the wall for a while. She wrote the way she talked, with a directness and a specific kind of noticing that made her descriptions feel exact. She wrote about one of her students, a boy of 10 named Tommy Burke, whose father worked in the mines and whose mother had died the previous year, and who came to school every morning 30 minutes before the other children and sat on the schoolhouse step to wait, and how she had taken to leaving the door unlocked so he could come in and sit by the stove. She wrote about the millinery shop widow, Mrs. Pratt, who had turned out to be one of the most genuinely funny people she had ever met, with a dry observation about human nature that Letitia had not expected from a woman who spent her days arranging hat displays. She wrote about the stars, and about looking up at the mountain where she knew his cabin was, and about imagining the elk on the ridge. He wrote back. She wrote again. They wrote through the whole of December and January, letters that arrived irregularly because the trails were what they were, but that built, one on another, a structure of knowing that was real and solid and grew between them like something with roots in deep soil. In February, a thaw came that was unusual for the altitude and the season, but that the mountains occasionally produced, a warm spell out of the southwest that softened the snow enough to make the lower trails passable for a few days. And Nelson rode down to Creede on a Thursday morning because he had provisions that were running low, and because he had 3 letters from Letitia sitting on the table that had arrived together after a long gap, and that had reset something in him that had been very still and patient, and was no longer entirely patient. He rode into Creede in the mid-morning and bought his provisions and picked up his mail and sent his reply letters with the postmaster, and then stood on the main street of Creede in the unusual February warmth and thought about what he was doing. He was going to the schoolhouse. He was going to the schoolhouse at midday, which was when the children had their dinner hour, and he was going to ask Letitia Hawthorne if she would take a walk with him. He was 33 years old, and he had not asked a woman to take a walk with him in a considerable number of years, and he found, approaching the schoolhouse, that his heartbeat was doing something it did not usually do, which was to make itself known to him in a way that was mildly inconvenient. He knocked on the schoolhouse door at noon. Letitia opened it and saw him, and her face went through 3 different things in rapid succession: surprise, genuine pleasure, and then something more carefully composed, and he had the clear impression that the last of the 3 was the one she defaulted to because the second one had alarmed her with its own intensity. "Nelson," she said. "I did not know you were coming. I had supplies to get," he said, and I thought. He stopped. He looked at her. He said, "I thought I would see if you wanted to walk." She looked at him for a moment, and then she turned back into the schoolhouse and picked up her coat from the hook by the door and put it on. "The children have 20 minutes yet," she said. "I can walk for 15. They walked down the main street of Creede together, and then along the bank of Willow Creek, where the thaw had opened the creek back up, and the water was running clear and cold between shelves of snow. She walked beside him with her hands in her coat pockets and the February sun on her face, and she looked like someone who was exactly where they wanted to be. "I was glad to get your letters," he said. "I was glad to get yours," she said. They walked in silence for a moment, and the creek ran beside them, and a jay called somewhere in the willows, and the mountain stood up white and enormous all around the valley. "Letitia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to be honest with you," he said, "because I think you are a woman who wants honest things said honestly." "I am," she said. She had stopped walking and was looking at him. "I have not spent much of my life looking for company," he said. "I have been content with the kind of life I have, and I was not looking to change it. But somewhere in the last several months, I have found that the change has already happened without my having looked for it, and I think I would be a fool to pretend that it has not." She was very still, and her eyes on him were the clearest and most direct they had ever been. "What I am saying," he said, because he had started and he was going to finish it properly, "is that I have come to care very much about you. And I would like the opportunity to say that in a plainer way over time, if you are willing to hear it." She was quiet for long enough that he had time to be aware of the creek and the jay and the cold, bright afternoon, and then she said, "Nelson Whitaker, you are the most careful man I have ever met." "Is that bad?" he asked. "No," she said. "It is very good. It means that when you say something you mean it precisely." She paused. "I care very much about you too. I have been trying to be sensible about it for several months, which has taken considerably more effort than I prefer to spend on being sensible." He looked at her. She looked at him. The creek ran beside them, and the mountains held them in their enormous, indifferent company. He reached out and took her hand, which was small and capable and cold in his, and she let him hold it and looked up at him with the full weight of her brown eyes. "I should get back," she said. "My students." "I know," he said. They walked back to the schoolhouse hand in hand, and at the door she took her hand back and looked at him with that expression he had seen on the boarding house porch in November, the private and careful and warm one. "Come to supper on Sunday," she said. "The thaw might hold another few days." "I will be here on Sunday," he said. He rode home that afternoon through the softening snow with the feeling that something that had been only potential for a very long time had become actual, and the change from potential to actual was a thing you could feel in your whole body, the way you felt a shift in the barometric pressure before a storm. The thaw held. He came on Sunday. He came again the following weekend when another brief warming opened the lower trails. And in the weeks between visits, they wrote to each other with a frankness that grew as spring approached, letters that were still proper in the way that 1884 required propriety, but that were warm in every particular that warmth could fill without crossing into something the letters could not carry. In March she told him, in a letter, about her father. He had died when she was 19, 7 years before she came west, of a fever that had taken him quickly from a strong, robust man to a grave in the space of 3 weeks. She had been close to him, she wrote, the way a person is close to the parent who matches them most in temperament, and his death had left a particular kind of silence in her life that she had never entirely filled. She had taken care of her mother through the long decline of the years following, and then when that was done, she had been alone in a way that was different from ordinary aloneness, not just without family, but without any of the people who had known her longest and seen her most clearly. Nelson read that letter twice and then held it in his hands for a while, and then he went outside and sat in his chair on the porch in the March cold and looked at the empty chair beside him and understood something about himself that he had not quite articulated before, that the chair was not evidence of waiting. It was evidence of knowing. Some part of him that had always understood that clarity of purpose and the rightness of a thing were not things you needed to explain. You just needed to act on them when the moment came. He wrote back to her about his mother, who had been a quiet and capable woman with a gift for observation that she had passed to him, along with the ability to be still and patient in the face of large things. About how his parents had been two people who made sense of the world better together than either of them did alone, and how he had watched them build something over the course of a life that was more than its individual parts, a whole that was also a home, and how he had always understood that the building of such a thing required both precision and time. She wrote back a letter that was the shortest she had ever written him, just 4 lines, and the last line was, "I think we are building something, Nelson Whitaker, and I believe it will be solid." He put that letter inside the cover of his Bible, which was where he kept the things that mattered most to him, and he thought about it for the remaining weeks of winter with the particular depth of attention he gave to things that he intended to keep. Spring came in the first week of April with the sudden full commitment that the Colorado mountains sometimes produced, as though the season had made up its mind all at once. The snow retreated to the highest ridges overnight, or so it seemed, and the south-facing meadow below Nelson's cabin erupted in the first pale green of new grass within the week, and the aspens that had been bare and gray began to show their small new leaves, and the creek below the mountain trail ran full and cold and loud with snowmelt. On the first Sunday in April, Letitia rode up the trail on her bay mare, and Nelson was standing on the porch when she came around the last bend. And it was the first time he had seen her since the February thaw, and the gap had been long enough that the sight of her coming up the path with the spring afternoon behind her, and her coat off, because the day was genuinely warm, did something decisive to his composure. She dismounted at the corral and he took the mare's reins and they stood close together, and she looked up at him and smiled, and he saw in her face what he understood was also in his own, something that did not need to be managed anymore. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. He kissed her then, because the moment required it, and he was a man who recognized the moment. And she kissed him back with all the directness she brought to everything, clear and warm and certain, and the spring afternoon stood around them like a benediction. After a moment she pulled back and looked at him with that rare expression he had seen only a handful of times, the one where the composure dropped entirely and just Letitia was there, open and clear and without any of her usual careful management of herself. "You were right," she said. "You are a man who is not careless with things that matter." "No," he said, "I am not." They sat on the porch together that afternoon, side by side in the two chairs, and he told her about a conversation he wanted to have, one that was as direct as he could make it. He told her that he had been thinking through the winter about what he wanted his life to look like, and that his thinking had arrived repeatedly at a clear and specific answer, which was that he wanted his life to look like this cabin on this mountain in this valley, with someone beside him who wanted to be there, not as a convenience or a compromise, but as a genuine desire for the same thing he wanted. He told her that he was not asking her to give up her life or her work or her purpose, because those things were part of who she was and he did not want parts of her subtracted. He told her that he was asking her if she wanted to build something with him, a real thing, the kind that took time and care and got better for the building. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "If that is what you want. I am not asking you to give up the school. I am not asking you to give up anything. I am asking you to add something." She was very quiet for a long time, and the valley below them spread out in the spring afternoon light, and the aspens flickered their new leaves, and somewhere in the forest above the cabin, a woodpecker was working with businesslike regularity. "This is a very unconventional proposal," she said at last. "I know," he said. "Most men ask a woman to give up a great deal," she said. "I am not most men," he said. She turned to look at him fully, and he saw in her eyes what he had hoped to see but had been too honest with himself to assume. "No," she said. "You are not." She paused. "Yes, Nelson, yes, I will marry you." He took her hand again, the same hand he had held in February by the creek, and he held it properly this time, the way he intended to hold it for a very long time. The wedding was in June. It was a simple affair by the standards of some places and a considerable production by the standards of Creede, Colorado, in 1884, which meant that the whole town came, all 60-some-odd citizens of it, and Randolph Gentry performed the honor of giving a speech that was 3 times longer than necessary but was genuinely felt, and Mrs. Pratt, the millinery widow, contributed a hat for Letitia that was beautiful and practical both, which was something Mrs. Pratt understood was the right combination for a woman who lived her life the way Letitia lived hers. Pete Garland came down from his supply run specially for it, which everyone understood to be a significant gesture, because Pete Garland was not a man who adjusted his schedule for anything short of genuine occasion. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a man named Treadwell who came through Creede once a month and who married them in the open air outside the church, because the church was too small for the number of people who wanted to see it done. The sky was a Colorado June blue, the precise color of nothing else, and the mountains stood in their summer grandeur all around the valley, and the aspens were in full leaf, and the meadows were full of the wildflowers that Nelson had told Letitia about in the dark of winter, yellow and white, and the particular blue of the columbine, which was the flower of Colorado, and which both of them had, independently, decided was the right flower for this particular mountain valley. He had brought a bunch of columbine down from the meadow above the cabin that morning, and he gave them to her before the ceremony, and she held them through the whole of it, standing beside him in the June sun with her flowers and her good hat, and the clear eyes that he had never once seen afraid even when she was frightened. They rode back to the cabin together after, with her mare and Amos side by side on the mountain trail, and the afternoon light came through the aspens in the particular way it had on the morning he had ridden her down to Creede that first time, and she rode beside him with the same companionable ease she had always had, and they talked and were quiet, and the mountain received them. When they came up the last stretch and the cabin came into view on its ledge of rock and pine, she pulled the mare up and looked at it for a moment. He stopped Amos beside her and looked at it with her, trying to see it through her eyes, the solid low shape of it against the hillside, the porch with its 2 chairs. "Home," she said. "Not a question." "Home," he agreed. She settled into the life of the mountain cabin with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything. She kept her teaching post and rode the trail between the cabin and Creede 4 days a week, a ride of about 40 minutes each way that she made on her bay mare in all weather except the heaviest snow, and she was the most reliable teacher Creede had seen, and every family in town would have said so. On the 5th day and the weekend she was at the cabin, and the cabin was different with her in it in ways that were not about any addition she made to the furnishings or the organization, though she did add to both, but about something more fundamental, a quality of life that filled the rooms the way the warmth of a stove fills a cold house, gradually and then completely. She brought books from the subscription library in Creede and stacked them on the shelves beside his, and when she read she did it in the second chair on the porch, the one he had made in the spring of 1883 before he had a reason, and every evening that she was there they sat side by side in those chairs and watched the valley and talked and were quiet in turns. And Nelson Whitaker, who had built that chair out of something he had not named and would not have explained, sat in his own chair and felt the particular quality of rightness that comes when a thing that was always incomplete becomes complete. He was trapping the creek system north of the cabin in the winter of 1884 and early 1885, when the trouble with Caleb Renner happened, which was the only time in their first year of marriage that Nelson felt his new life threatened in a specific and external way. Renner was a trapper who had come into the valley from the east that fall, and had set his lines in the same creek system without establishing prior claim, which was a violation of the informal but firmly observed code by which trappers in the high country managed their territories. Nelson had spoken to him about it once in October, directly and without hostility, explaining the arrangement, and Renner had nodded and seemed to understand, and then through November had continued trapping the same lines. It escalated slowly and then suddenly, as these things did, and in the second week of January Nelson came back from checking his lines to find Renner at the cabin, standing on the porch in a way that was not the way a reasonable man stood at another man's door, aggressive in his posture, and in the loudness with which he was demanding to be let in. Letitia had not let him in. She was standing in the doorway, the door half open behind her and one hand on the frame, and she was talking to Renner in the calm, precise way she talked when she had made a decision and was not moving from it. And Renner was about 40, a large man going to fat, and clearly not accustomed to being calmly denied. Nelson came around the side of the cabin, and Renner saw him and turned, and the next several minutes were tense in the way that physical confrontations in the mountains were tense, with a great deal of weight behind the possibility of violence and both men aware of it. Nelson did not reach for his rifle, which was on his back, and he did not raise his voice. He simply walked up to within 10 feet of Renner and told him that his lines were set in country that was claimed, and that the next time Renner pulled from them, Nelson would report it to the territorial marshal out of Alamosa, and that the marshal, who was a man named Horace Tully and who had come through Creede twice in the past year, and who Nelson knew by name, would take a straightforward view of the matter. Renner made several statements of the kind men make when they are considering whether to escalate or withdraw, and Nelson waded through each one with the patience of a man who had no desire for violence and no fear of it either, and eventually the weight of that combination worked the same way it usually worked, and Renner left. Letitia stood in the doorway and watched him go down the trail and then looked at Nelson. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "You?" "I have dealt with difficult fathers before," she said. "The principle is the same. Most men who make that kind of noise are not genuinely committed to the actions they are implying." "He is not entirely that kind," Nelson said. "He may come back." "Then we will deal with him if he comes back," she said. "Come in, you are cold." He came in. She made coffee and they sat at the table, and he told her what the situation was with the trap lines, and she listened without interrupting, and when he was done she said, "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing right now," he said. "If he comes back when I am not here, do not open the door." "I had already decided that," she said. Renner did not come back. Whether he found easier territory elsewhere or whether the mention of Marshal Tully had genuinely discouraged him, Nelson never knew. The trap lines ran undisturbed through the rest of the winter, and that was the end of it. In the spring of 1885, Letitia told him, on a Sunday morning when the snow was retreating from the lower meadows, and the columbine had not yet appeared but the earth smelled of what was coming, that she was expecting their first child. He was at the workbench inside the cabin, fitting a joint on a new cabinet he was building for the kitchen shelves, and she came and stood beside him and said it simply and directly, in the way she said everything that mattered. He set down the chisel and the mallet and turned to look at her, and the morning light was in her face, and she was watching him with those direct brown eyes that had always and without apology given him exactly what she was feeling. He put his hands on her face, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then he held her against him in the morning quiet of the cabin, and he thought, with a completeness he had never previously experienced, that this was what the chairs had been for, not only for the two of them but for what came after. The child was born in November of 1885. He was a boy, which surprised neither of them particularly, though if either had a preference it was the kind of preference that dissolved entirely upon the actual arrival of the actual child. They named him James, after Letitia's father, who had been James Hawthorne of Baltimore, the furniture maker who had taught his daughter to look at a chair and know whether the proportions were right. James Whitaker arrived in the world on a night when the first heavy snow of the season was coming down outside the cabin windows, and the storm that night was a considerable one, and Nelson had ridden hard to Creede and back with the midwife, a capable woman named Agnes Blount, and they had made it through the storm and back to the cabin with time to spare. And Agnes had presided over the whole affair with the calm authority of a woman who had seen this particular drama in many different variations and knew exactly how to manage every version of it. Letitia was magnificent. Nelson held her hand through the hardest hours of it, and she said what she needed to say when she needed to say it, and did not say anything unnecessary. And when James arrived, he arrived with a sound that was immediately and irrevocably the most important sound Nelson had ever heard. He held his son in his arms, and the boy looked up at him with the unfocused, wondering gaze of the newly born. And the snow came down outside, and the stove burned warm, and Letitia lay against the pillow with her hair loose, and her face open in the particular way of a woman who has just done a large and definitive thing and knows it. "James," Nelson said to the boy. The boy offered no opinion. Letitia laughed softly. "He will be more vocal in about 3 weeks," she said. She was correct. She took a term away from the school when James was born and came back in February, and they worked out the arrangement between them with the same practical intelligence they brought to everything. Her riding in on school days with James settled in a basket in front of her saddle, until he was old enough to make the ride something other than straightforward, and eventually a woman in Creede named Clara Benitez, who was the wife of one of the Mexican miners and who was warm and reliable and had 5 children of her own, agreed to watch James on the days Letitia rode in, for a wage that was fair, and that Letitia negotiated with the same directness she brought to everything. James grew. Children do this with a speed that is consistently unexpected, no matter how much you have been told about it. He was a serious boy, quiet in the way his father was quiet but with his mother's directness, the combination of which produced a child who said very little and meant every word of it. He could walk by 12 months and by 18 months was following his father around the property with the single-minded determination of someone who has decided that there is nowhere more important to be. Nelson showed him things: the right way to hold a chisel, the difference between the tracks of a doe deer and a buck, the names of the stars that were visible on clear winter nights from the porch of the cabin. James absorbed all of it with the focused gravity of the very young. In the autumn of 1887, Letitia told him that there would be a second child. This time she told him in the evening on the porch, with James asleep inside, and the fall stars beginning to appear above the valley and the air carrying the first edge of the coming cold. He took her hand in both of his and held it and looked at her in the starlight. "Are you happy?" he asked, because it was what he always asked when something significant happened, not because he doubted the answer but because he wanted her to say it in her own words. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," she said, which is a thing I did not expect to say with as much certainty as I am saying it. "I know the feeling," he said. "Do you?" she said with the small edge of teasing in her voice that she had developed over the years, the one she used only with him. "I built a chair once," he said, "before I had a reason. I have spent some years since then deciding whether that was foolish or whether it was something more like faith." She turned on him with the look that was entirely hers, the one that made him feel seen all the way through, from the surface to wherever the deepest part of him was. "And what have you decided?" "Faith," he said. "Definitely faith." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the stars came out above the valley one by one, and the aspens below the cabin were gold in what little light remained from the west, and Nelson Whitaker sat in his chair on the porch of the cabin he had built from nothing, and held his wife's hand, and looked out over the valley. He had chosen all those years ago, when he had come north from Texas with a mule and a rifle and a set of chisels, and no very clear plan beyond the decision to be where he was supposed to be. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1888 with considerably less drama than her brother had managed, arriving on a morning in April that was so brilliantly clear and warm that Agnes Blount remarked afterward that it was as though the child had decided to coordinate her entrance with the best possible weather conditions. They named her Clara, after the woman who had watched over James on school days with such warm competence, which moved Clara Benitez to an extent that she was not quite willing to admit openly, but that everyone in the relevant circle understood. Clara Whitaker was nothing like her brother. Where James was quiet and deliberate, Clara was emphatic and immediate, an opinion-having person from the first weeks of her life, with a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, and an approach to the world that was her mother's directness turned up to a volume that occasionally startled even Letitia. She walked earlier than James had, talked earlier, and had a decided view about everything from which toys were worth her time to which particular configuration of her evening food was acceptable. Nelson, who had spent his whole life being the most committed person in any room he entered, found that his daughter challenged that distinction in ways he could only respect. James adored her from the first day. He was 2.5 when she arrived, and he approached the whole business of having a sister with the same seriousness he brought to everything, sitting beside her basket in the first days, and watching her with the intense attention of a person taking very careful notes. Nelson watched his son watching his daughter and felt something in his chest that was so large it did not have a name. Life on the mountain in the late 1880s was good. It was not easy, because nothing at altitude in Colorado was easy, and the winters still required everything they had always required, and the work was always physical and always demanding and always present. But it was good in the way that things made to last are good, solidly, and without the fragility of things assembled in haste. Letitia continued teaching through those years, and she became not just the teacher of Creede but one of the defining figures of the town's character, the person who pushed for a second classroom when enrollment outgrew the first, the person who organized the first lending library with books donated from everyone who had any to spare, the person who argued, more than once and with characteristic precision, for the education of the Mexican and Chinese children whose fathers worked in the mines, and who were initially not welcomed into the school by certain elements of the town's establishment. She made that argument in the school board meeting of 1887 with such clarity and such patient completeness that even the most resistant members of the board found themselves without a defensible response. And the following Monday morning, the school opened its doors to every child in the valley, regardless of what language was spoken at home, which was an outcome that had been far from guaranteed when she had stood up to speak. Nelson was proud of her in the specific way he was proud of everything she did, which was quietly and completely. He said so on the evening after the school board meeting, sitting on the porch in the September dusk. "You are not surprised," she said. "No," he said. "But I am proud. It is the right thing," she said. "It is simply the right thing. I cannot teach some children and not others. It would be a lie. It is also not without cost," he said. "There are people in that town who will not forgive it. I am aware," she said. "I find I am able to manage their disapproval." He had never doubted it. By 1889, James was 4 years old, and asking questions about everything with an intensity that occasionally exhausted even his mother, who was accustomed to children's questions in a professional capacity. He wanted to know how the stove worked, and why the creek ran the direction it ran, and where the elk went in the deepest part of the winter, and what the stars were made of, and whether the mountains had always been there or whether they had grown from somewhere else. Nelson answered every question honestly, and at whatever length the question required, and Letitia supplemented with the information that 4 years of teaching had given her about the capacity of young minds, and between the two of them James received an education that was well in advance of his age and entirely suited to the particular boy he was. Clara at 18 months was walking everywhere, determinedly and at high speed, and had developed a specific relationship with Amos the gray gelding that was the most indulgent thing Nelson had ever permitted, which was the privilege of being lifted up to touch Amos's nose every single morning, which Clara had decided was a necessary part of her day, and which Amos, who had spent 12 years being a patient and dignified horse, accepted with a suffering grace that Nelson found genuinely comic. In the autumn of 1889, the whole county felt the shift that came when Colorado's silver economy was at its height, and the money was flowing into towns like Creede, and building them into something that was part frontier and part genuine city, or at least a town that aspired to the complexity of a city, with its new bank and its new hotel and the stagecoach line that now ran 3 times a week, and the telegraph office that opened in June of that year, and that changed. In ways both practical and profound, the character of a place that had previously been as isolated as the mountains required. Creede's growth brought opportunities and brought complications, as all growth does. More miners meant more money and more disorder, and the spring of 1890 brought a particular wave of newcomers that included a significant population of men who had no interest in permanence and considerable interest in the things that mining towns provided for men without permanent intentions. The 2 saloons on the main street of Creede became 4. The gambling increased, and so did the drinking, and so did the arguments that followed both. Nelson watched it from the distance of his mountain and felt no particular pull to involve himself in it. He had lived near enough to such things in Texas to know that they had their own gravity and their own resolution, and that a man with a family and a home and a life he valued was better served by maintaining the conditions of that life than by inserting himself into the complications of others. He kept his cabin on his ledge and his trap lines in the high valleys and his guiding work in the summer, and he was known in Creede as a man of complete reliability and good judgment, which meant that when people needed something done in the mountains, they came to him, and when they needed advice about the high country, they came to him, and he gave them what he had and charged fairly and went home. But in the October of 1890, a situation arose that was harder to stand outside of, and that was the matter of a young woman named Rosie Quan, whose father ran the laundry on the east end of Creede, and who was one of Letitia's students, 17 years old and one of the sharpest minds in the schoolroom, who was being pressured by a mining company foreman named Dyer to leave school and go to work for him in the mining camp office. The pressure was not entirely economic in its character, and when Letitia understood its full nature, she addressed it in the way she addressed all injustice, directly and without equivocation, taking the matter to the school board and then to the territorial office, and then, when necessary, to the marshal. Nelson drove her to a limosa for the meeting with the territorial education office in the wagon, and he sat outside in the territorial building's corridor while she went in and presented the case with the documented clarity she had spent 3 weeks assembling. And when she came out an hour later with the outcome she had been pursuing, which was a letter to the school board affirming the right of every enrolled student to attend school without employer interference. She was composed and very slightly fierce in the way she was fierce when she had fought for something and won. He helped her up into the wagon and handed her the letter, and she held it carefully against the October wind. "Well done," he said. "Rosie Quan deserves to be in that schoolroom," she said. "She is going to do remarkable things if she is given half a chance." "She will have the chance," he said. He drove home through the autumn mountains, and Letitia sat beside him on the wagon seat and leaned against his arm, and was quiet in the tired way of someone who has spent a large amount of herself on a necessary thing. And he was very aware of her beside him, and very aware that this was exactly the woman he had chosen, and that he would choose her again without hesitation every single time. Rosie Quan finished school in 1891, the best in her class, and went on to complete additional education in Denver, which was an outcome that Letitia referenced for years afterward as evidence that the fight had been worth exactly what it had cost. James turned 6 in November of 1891 and started school in Creede with the peculiar experience of being taught by his own mother, which he managed with a dignity that his parents found impressive. He was a careful student and a thoughtful one, and he had his father's patience and his mother's precision, and Letitia taught him with the same rigor she applied to every child in her care, neither harder nor easier, which was a thing James understood and respected even at 6 years old. Clara at 3 was the force of nature she had always been, and the cabin on the mountain ledge resonated with her particular brand of emphatic opinion. She had decided that she wanted to learn to carve, having watched her father at the workbench from her earliest mobility, and Nelson set aside a soft piece of basswood and a small dull chisel, and showed her the most basic principle, which was that you always carved away from yourself, and she understood and applied it immediately, and spent 3 weeks producing something that she insisted was a bear, and that bore a sufficient resemblance to a bear to be accepted as such by everyone who examined it. Nelson put it on the mantelpiece between the elk and the horse he had carved in those first solitary winters, and it stayed there. In the spring of 1892, on a morning in May when the high meadows were just coming into their full color, and the columbine were beginning to open, Nelson took Letitia up to the highest meadow above the cabin, the one that required 2 hours of climbing, and that he had always gone to alone before, and he showed her the place he had been going for 10 years when he needed the deepest version of the stillness the mountains could provide. It was a bowl of rock and grass and late-season wildflowers that sat just below the final ridgeline, open to the south and sheltered on the north by a shoulder of granite that cut the worst of the wind, and from its edge you could see the entire length of the valley below, the town of Creede at the far southern end, and beyond it the plains beginning to open up, and to the north the higher peaks that were still white in May, and all around the sky in every direction. Letitia stood at the edge of the meadow and looked at all of it for a long time without saying anything. "This is where you come," she said at last. "Yes," he said. "How long have you been coming here?" "Since the first summer," he said, 1882. She turned to look at him. "You never brought me before." "No," he said. "Why now?" He thought about how to say it and decided to say it straight, the way she had always preferred things said. "Because it was the last thing that was entirely mine," he said, "and I wanted it to be ours." She looked at him for a moment with the full weight of all 7 years of knowing him, all of what that look contained by now, the full catalog of early mornings and mountain winters and children and letters and laughter, and the long evenings on the porch, and he looked back at her with everything he had. She walked to him and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, in the high meadow above the valley with the columbine at their feet and the sky enormous above them, and the mountains holding them in the oldest and most indifferent and most trustworthy of all embraces. "Thank you," she said, against his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, against her hair. They stayed up there for an hour, and ate the lunch she had packed and watched the clouds move over the high peaks, and talked about the children, and the coming summer, and a new school reader she was considering, and whether the beaver population in the North Creek system had recovered enough from the previous winter's trapping to sustain another season. And they were entirely comfortable and entirely themselves, and entirely together. On the way back down the mountain she slipped on a wet patch of rock and he caught her arm and she caught his, and they stood for a moment on the steep slope with their hands locked on each other's arms and laughed, the kind of laughter that happens when the danger has passed and the relief of it and the absurdity of it arrive at the same moment. "I have you," he said. "I know," she said. "You always have me." He loved her so much in that moment that he could not speak, and she saw it in his face, and did not require him to. The summer of 1892 was the summer Nelson finished a new piece of work that he had been planning in his mind, since before James was born, and that he finally had both the time and the materials to execute. It was a table, larger than the one they had, a proper family table that could seat 6 or 8, made from a walnut log he had hauled up the mountain the previous fall at considerable effort, a log that had the kind of grain and depth of color that made furniture that would outlast everyone who ever sat at it. He worked on it through June and July, in the mornings before the heat of the day, and Letitia brought him coffee and sometimes sat at the workbench with him and talked while he worked, and James came and watched with the absorbed attention that he brought to his father's craft work, and Clara came and intermittently offered opinions that were definitive and occasionally useful. When it was done, he brought it inside, and they had their first meal at it with a ceremony that was entirely of the children's invention, Clara having decided that the introduction of a new table was an occasion that required something special on the plates, which meant that Letitia made the corn pudding that had been the first meal she had ever cooked in this kitchen, all the way back in the early autumn of 1884. And they ate it at the new table, with the evening light coming through the window, and the two children asking questions, and the mountain outside going through its familiar and inexhaustible beauty. After the children were in bed, Nelson and Letitia sat on the porch in their chairs, and he told her what he had been thinking about while he built the table. "I was thinking about what gets left behind," he said, "not in a sad way, in the way that a piece of good wood thinks about being a chair if it thought about anything. The table will be here when we are not. The chairs are already 10 years old and will go on longer than that. The children will be here," she said. "Yes," he said, "they will be here. And they will have children if they choose to, and those children will be here. And the cabin will be here, and the table and the chairs and the valley." "You are saying something about permanence," she said. "I am saying something about the difference between things that last and things that do not," he said. "I have spent my whole life trying to build things that last. I spent a long time not being certain I was capable of building anything that mattered." She reached across between the chairs and took his hand. "Look at this," she said. "I know," he said. "No, look at it properly," she said. "Look at what you have built." He looked at the valley below. He looked at the cabin behind them. He looked at her hand in his and thought about the boy and the girl asleep inside and the empty chair that was empty no longer and had not been for 8 years. "A man builds a chair before he has a reason," he said. "And then the reason arrives," she said. "And sits down like she knew," he said. She turned to look at him with the slow smile that he had loved since the first time it happened, and loved more now than he could have imagined loving anything. "I did know," she said. "From the moment I saw it sitting there beside yours. I looked at those two chairs and I thought, someone here has been waiting for something without knowing that he was waiting." "And you thought it was you," he said. "I thought it might be," she said. "I was not certain enough to say so, but I thought it might be." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, which was something he did sometimes when there was nothing better to say, which was rarely but sometimes, and this was one of those times. The years that followed were the good full years of a life built right. James grew tall and serious and good-humored in the measured way of a person who finds humor in the right places and does not perform it. And by the time he was 12, he was his father's full apprentice in the cabin's construction work, understanding joints and measures and the nature of different woods with the instinctive aptitude of a child who had grown up with chisels and shavings. He had also, like his mother, a gift for language, and he had filled 3 notebooks with observations about the natural world around the cabin that were, in Letitia's professional estimation, remarkable in their precision for a boy of his age. Clara at 9 was already the most forceful personality in her schoolroom, which Letitia taught with careful neutrality and genuine pride, and she had decided that she was going to be a doctor, a declaration she had made at age 7, and that she had not revised and did not appear to intend to revise. She had arrived at this decision after watching Agnes Blount, who was still the town's midwife and the closest thing Creede had to a medical practitioner, set a broken arm for the young Asir from the boarding house dinner, and something about the competence and the purpose of it had connected with something in Clara that was fundamental. Nelson did not tell her it was impossible, because he did not believe in telling people things were impossible simply because they were unusual, and Letitia did not either. And so the declaration stood and was treated in the Whitaker household as a settled fact about the future. The autumn of 1894 brought a particular test to the family that came in the form of a winter of exceptional severity, the worst Nelson had seen in his 12 years on the mountain. The snows came in October, heavy and early, and by December the cabin was locked in by drifts that came to the window ledges, and the trail to Creede was impassable for weeks at a time. They had laid in sufficient provisions because Nelson was always methodical about provisions, and because the summer had been generous, but the weeks of full isolation were long and required the same kind of patient endurance that the mountains always ultimately required. They were not unhappy. They were together in 4 walls in a deep winter on a mountain ledge, and they were entirely not unhappy. which was a thing Nelson thought about sometimes. Sitting at the walnut table with the lamplight and the stove going and James doing his lessons at one end and Clara at the other, and Letitia reading by the lamp, and the snow coming down outside without interruption, and the wind doing what the wind did at altitude. He thought, I built a second chair before I had a reason, and the reason arrived, and everything that came after is what comes when you are paying attention. When the trails opened again in March, Letitia rode down to Creede for the first time in 6 weeks and found that, during the severe winter, Mrs. Pratt, the millinery widow, had fallen ill and died, which was a genuine grief for her, and that 2 of her students' families had decided to leave Creede for Denver, which affected her in the specific way that losing students always affected her, with the sense of interrupted possibility. But the school was intact, and the town was intact, and Clara Benitez, who had watched the children those early years, sent word that her own eldest daughter was beginning to teach, and there was the sense everywhere of a community that had endured and come through intact. Nelson built a new woodshed that spring to replace one that had partially collapsed under the exceptional snow weight of the winter, and James helped him build it with a capability that made the building faster and better than it would otherwise have been. They worked in companionable silence broken by the kinds of practical conversations that good work generates, and when they were done they stood back and looked at what they had made with the satisfaction of 2 people who know that what they have made is solid. It is a good shed, James said. It is, Nelson said. Will you teach me to make furniture? James asked. The way you make furniture, not just the structural things, the real woodworking. Yes, Nelson said. I will teach you everything I know. And he did, through that summer and the next, spending the evenings and the early mornings showing James the principles of jointery and finishing and grain reading, and the particular meditative patience that good furniture required. And James received it all with the focused gravity that was entirely his own and made it his own. And by the time he was 14, he had made a small cabinet that Nelson assessed honestly and found to be very good work. Letitia put the cabinet in the bedroom and it stayed there. In 1896, Nelson turned 45 and Letitia turned 39 in Creede, Colorado, had grown into something that was not quite a city, but was no longer a frontier town in any simple sense, with a proper doctor now and a second school teacher and a hotel that had a dining room and a photographer who had come from Denver and set up a studio on the main street. The silver that had built Creede was beginning its long decline by then, the mines less rich than they had been, and some of them played out entirely, and the population had begun to shrink back toward the size of a genuine mountain town, which Creede would ultimately remain. Nelson and Letitia were neither diminished nor destabilized by any of this. They were what they were, which was a man and a woman who had built something on a ledge of rock in the mountains of Colorado and had tended it with care for 12 years. And the larger movements of boom and bust, and the passage of time and the changing fortunes of silver towns were things that happened around them, and that they watched with interest and compassion, and without the kind of personal vulnerability that came from having staked everything on the thing that was changing. On the evening of their 12th anniversary, which was a June evening in 1896, they sat on the porch in their chairs, and the valley below was in its full summer splendor, and James was inside reading, and Clara was somewhere in the forest above the cabin, having an adventure that she would narrate at dinner with the vividness she brought to all narration. And the aspens were in full leaf, and the air smelled of the particular combination of pine and cold water and high-altitude sky that Nelson had loved since the first morning he had crested the pass into this valley. 12 years, Letitia said. 12 years, he agreed. Do you know what I think about sometimes? She said. Tell me, he said. I think about arriving here, she said, on that bay mare in the September evening, exhausted and lost and entirely uncertain of everything, and seeing you standing on the porch, and the 2 chairs. What did you think? He asked. In that first moment, she smiled. I thought you were the largest man I had ever seen and that I hoped you were not dangerous. And then, he said, And then I thought that you were going to help me, she said. I could see it in you immediately. The kind of person who helps because it is the right thing to do, not because of any calculation. And the chairs, he said. The chairs, she said. I noticed them almost immediately. Two chairs perfectly matched side by side. And I thought she paused and the small smile stayed on her face. I thought, someone here is ready for something without knowing it. I did not know it, he said. I know you did not, she said. That was what made it so. She thought about the word. True, she said. It made it true. A man does not build a chair for a woman he is expecting. He builds a chair out of something older and quieter than expectation, something that knows before the mind does. He thought about the April morning in 1883 when he had gone out to the woodpile with the image of the chair already fully formed and the reason for it entirely absent. And he thought about the way the human heart sometimes understands things that the mind has not yet arrived at, the way good wood knows the shape it is meant to become before the chisel finds it. I believe that is true, he said. I sat down in that chair, she said, like I knew. You did, he said. Because I did, she said. From the first moment I sat in it, I knew. He reached across and took her hand, the same hand he had taken in that February by the creek in 1885, the same hand he had held through the birth of their children, and the difficult winters and the ordinary evenings and the extraordinary mornings on the mountain above the world. And he held it now in the June dusk, with the valley spread below them, and the life they had built solid around them, and the lives of their children shining ahead. And he thought that if a man lived to be 100, he could not find a better word for what this was. Home. James was 18 in 1903 and went to Colorado Springs to study engineering, a decision he had arrived at through the same careful deliberation he brought to everything, understanding that the mountains he loved and the precision of building things he loved could be combined in the work of an engineer in a way that suited the particular shape of his mind and his gifts. He came back to the cabin every summer and at Christmas, and the returns were always good. James walking up the path from where he left his horse and coming around the side of the cabin to where his father was usually at the workbench. And the conversation they had every time was the best kind of conversation, which was one that picked up where it had left off and did not require the preliminary work of re-establishing what two people meant to each other. Clara at 15 had lost none of her certainty about being a doctor and had gained considerable additional knowledge to support it, having attached herself with characteristic determination to the town doctor, a man named Harrison, who had the good sense to recognize genuine intellectual ability when he saw it, and who had begun lending her medical texts that she read with the same focus her father brought to the grain of a difficult piece of wood. Letitia continued to teach. The school had a second teacher now and then a third, and Letitia was the head teacher, which meant that she set the curriculum and managed the other teachers, and was the first person that parents came to with every concern from the academic to the personal. And she handled all of it with the capability that she had brought to every part of her life. In 1905, they added a room to the cabin, a proper second bedroom for when James came home, and Clara brought friends, built from the same rock and pine as the original cabin, fitted and finished with the care that Nelson had always given to everything he made. James came home for the summer specifically to help build it, and the two of them worked through June and July, and by August it was done, solid and right and exactly fitted to the hill behind the cabin, as though it had always intended to be there. Clara went to Denver for medical school in 1907, which was a thing that required fighting for in ways that were predictable, and that Clara fought for in the way she fought for everything, which was with total commitment and specific knowledge, and the refusal to be told that the shape of her ambitions was determined by the fact of her being a woman. Letitia supported every stage of the fight with every tool she had, and Nelson paid the tuition with what he had been setting aside for exactly this purpose for the better part of 6 years. The morning Clara rode away down the mountain trail, sitting straight in the saddle the way her mother had sat straight on the day she arrived, Nelson stood on the porch and watched her go around the last bend, and Letitia stood beside him. "She is going to be remarkable," Letitia said. "She already is," he said. "She gets it from you," Letitia said. He looked at her. "She gets it from her mother," he said. "Every last piece of it." Letitia put her arm through his and leaned against him, and they stood together on the porch, and the valley below held the morning in its enormous familiar cup, and the aspens were in their September gold, and everything was exactly and completely and permanently what it had been for 23 years, which was to say, right. In 1910, Nelson Whitaker was 59 years old and Letitia was 53, and they had been married for 26 years, which was longer than some people's whole lives in the country they lived in, and not long enough by the estimation of either of them. His hair had gone mostly gray, and his hands had more scars on them than they had had, and the mountain mornings were something he felt in his joints in a way he had not felt them at 30. But he was sound and strong and capable of everything that the life he had built required. Letitia had taken the gray in her own hair with the equanimity she took everything, noting its arrival with a directness that was entirely characteristic, and proceeding with her life in the same manner as before, which was to say at full engagement and without apology. James had finished his engineering degree and was working for a mining infrastructure company in Colorado Springs, designing the systems that moved water and waste through the increasingly complex operations of the mining industry. He was good at it and he was happy, and in 1909 he had brought a young woman named Ruth up the mountain trail to meet his parents, and Ruth had looked at the cabin and the valley, and the two chairs on the porch with the expression of a person taking very accurate measurements of something important. And Letitia had decided within the first hour that she was exactly the right person for James, which she expressed to Nelson that evening with the succinct directness that he had always loved. "She looks at things the way he looks at things," Letitia said. "That is everything." James and Ruth were married in the spring of 1910 in Colorado Springs, and Nelson and Letitia rode the train down and back, which was itself a novelty of the modern age that the mountains had finally been connected to, and they sat in the train car on the way home through the mountains and watched the familiar landscape go by from this unfamiliar angle and held hands across the narrow space between the seats. "We are going to be grandparents," Letitia said. "Eventually," he said. "Sooner than you think," she said, with the tone that meant she knew something he did not. She was right. James and Ruth's first child arrived in the winter of 1911, a boy they named Nelson James Whitaker, after his grandfather, which was a thing that affected Nelson's composure in a way that very little had affected it in his adult life, so that he had to look out the window for a moment and find the mountains, which were where he had always gone when feelings exceeded what was available to manage them. Clara came home from Denver in 1912, fully qualified, and she came home to Creede not to leave again, which was a choice she had made carefully and that she explained to her parents on the evening she arrived, sitting in the kitchen over supper. "There are people here who have nothing," she said. "No doctor who is close, no reliable medicine, no one who understands what they need. I'm not going to San Francisco. I'm going to practice medicine in this valley." Nelson looked at his daughter, 24 years old, with her mother's directness and her father's certainty and a quality that was entirely her own, which was the particular fierce compassion of a person who has chosen a calling and knows why. "Creede is lucky," he said. "Creede is going to find out," she said. "And it did, Doctor." Clara Whitaker opened her practice in Creede in the summer of 1912 in the building next to the hardware store, and within a year she was the most essential person in the valley, known to every family from the mining camps to the high ranches, riding out in any weather to see anyone who needed her, charging those who could pay and adjusting for those who could not, with the same clear ethical framework her mother had applied to the school for 30 years. On a Sunday in October of 1912, the whole family came to the cabin on the mountain ledge for dinner. James and Ruth drove up from where they were staying in Creede with young Nelson, who was 1 year old and had both his grandfather's gray eyes and his grandmother's direct gaze, a combination that boded interestingly for his future. Clara rode up from her practice. Nelson had been cooking since morning, a proper meal that took the whole day to prepare, and Letitia had made the corn pudding because it was required. They ate at the walnut table that Nelson had built in the summer of 1892, which had been in the center of that room for 20 years, and showed no signs of being anything other than permanent. The lamplight was warm, and the stove was warm, and outside the October mountains were in their last color before the cold took the aspens bare again. And around the table were the people who were the whole architecture of the life Nelson Whitaker had built, beginning from nothing but a mule and a saw and a set of chisels, and the knowledge of where he needed to be. After dinner the children were in bed, and Ruth was resting in the new bedroom and James was reading at the table, and Nelson and Letitia were on the porch in their chairs as the night came down fully over the valley. The chairs were 30 years old now. He had repaired them both once some years back, replacing a back rail on his and refinishing the seat on hers, but they were the same chairs in everything that mattered, shaped by the same hands from the same wood in the same spring when he had not known who he was building for. "I have been thinking," Letitia said, "about something I want to tell you." "Tell me," he said. "I have been thinking about the day I arrived," she said. "September of 1884. Lost in the mountains and afraid, though I would not have said so at the time, and exhausted and uncertain about everything I had decided. And then the cabin on the ledge and you on the porch. And the chairs." "You have thought about this before," he said. "I think about it regularly," she said. "I find it does not diminish with repetition. The thinking, I mean." She paused. "What I have been thinking specifically is about what it means that you built that chair. Not what it meant about me or about us or about what has come after, what it meant about you." He waited. "It means," she said, "that you were already in some part of yourself ready to love someone before I existed in your life. Before there was any specific person to love, you were ready, and the chair was the proof of it." He considered this for a long time with the full weight of his attention. "I think you are right," he said. "I know I am right," she said without any arrogance in it. "You are a man who was made to love someone deeply and well. The chair is just the evidence, like a geologist looking at rock and telling you what the mountain has been doing for 1,000 years. He smiled, which was something that happened more easily now than it had when he was 31 and alone on this ledge with 2 chairs and no reason for one of them. "And you," he said, "what does your arrival here tell about you?" She thought about it in the honest way, not the quick way. "That I was not afraid of the unfamiliar," she said. "That I trusted the things I could see in a person over the things I had been told to look for. That I could sit down in a chair that was not mine and feel immediately that it was right." She paused. "That I was already looking, even when I did not know I was looking." He reached across and took her hand for the 1,000th or the 10,000th time, and the valley below them was dark now except for the lights of Creede at the far southern end, and above them the October stars were doing what they had always done, which was to be innumerable and incomprehensible and entirely reliable. "Nelson," she said. "Yes," he said, "thank you for the chair." He pressed her hand between both of his. "Thank you for sitting in it," he said. The mountains held them in their enormous patience, and the stars turned overhead, and the night was cold and clear, and the cabin behind them was warm and full of the people they loved, and they sat in their chairs on the porch, the 2 chairs that had stood side by side for 30 years now, and they were old enough to know that everything had gone exactly as it should have and young enough in the places that mattered to know that it was still going that way. And neither of them said anything else for a long time, because neither of them needed to. Inside, young Nelson James Whitaker slept in his basket with his grandfather's gray eyes closed and his grandmother's future in him. And James and Ruth slept in the new bedroom, and Clara slept in the original room where she had grown up. And the stove burned down to coals, and the October wind moved through the aspens with the sound that aspens make, which is like water running over smooth stones, and the cabin on the ledge was what it had always been. What Nelson Whitaker had built it to be, and what Letitia Hawthorne had made it more fully, when she rode up the path on her exhausted bay mare in the September evening of 1884, and saw the porch and the two chairs, and sat down in the empty one. Like she knew, because she did, she always had, and so had he. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly right.